大家好，又到我英國時間朝早9點鐘，香港時間而家應該係下晝4點鐘。我哋今集係第14集啦。我哋上一集講嘅就係關於應唔應該留級嘅問題。咁如果你想睇翻上一集嘅內容嘅話，就去翻之前嘅 Facebook page 或者去我個 YouTube channel 都可以睇翻。再講一次，如果你認為我哋分享嘅內容係有用嘅話，請你俾我哋一個 like 同埋 share 俾更加多嘅香港人知道關於英國專業嘅教育資訊。今集我哋好榮幸可以請到我補習學校嘅另一位老師 Mark 老師嚟到幫大家介紹一下佢自己啦，同埋最緊要係分享一下關於佢點樣去幫小朋友去學英文，因為佢已經有超過30年嘅經驗喺私立學校。咁但係詳細我會俾佢介紹自己。Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Leo. How are you?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Yeah, very well. Very well.
Good.
Yeah.
Can you introduce yourself, including your experience in teaching English and your teaching style?
Sure, yes. So my name is Mark Fraser. I've been an English teacher for 30 years plus, working almost exclusively in the independent sector, generally in senior schools, but working with prep schools as well, so across the whole age range. And actually I've worked from ages 2 up to 18 and Oxbridge entry and that sort of thing. My background is in the theatre, so I've also worked as a drama teacher throughout that time, and then for the last 8 years of my time working in schools, I was a director of digital learning. So I was fascinated in the ways in which we can use digital technology to improve the learning process, and ideally we should be using it to transform the way schools run, but that's a little way off yet. And I did quite a lot of work throughout my time there, especially when I was head of English, working on the entrance process to the senior school where I was working. So that involved setting exams, marking exams, conducting all the interviews, where they were applying for certain scholarships, for drama scholarships and things, running practical sessions as well. And my teaching style, well, there's a couple of strands to it really. I'm a great believer in the growth mindset. So that's about finding challenges for the students and making sure that they're constantly being challenged, and I saw my job as finding things that were always just slightly too difficult for them to do. So I always felt that if everyone in a class got everything right, then I should apologize to them for wasting their time. The last thing I wanted to see was 100%. I want to see people not quite able to do things. And it's about finding a balance between things that are within reach, but just slightly too difficult for them. For me, that's what the growth mindset is about. And so it means that you can work with any student of any level, and what you're looking for is progress. So that sense of constant progress is the key thing. Of course, the progress never goes in a straight line. You go ups and downs and backs and forwards, but over time you're looking for that progress. And then the other strand really of my teaching has always been about creativity. So language should be fun. People should enjoy using language. It comes alive when we play with it, when we experiment with it, when we're not too bound by what we think we should be doing. So anything to free people to use language creatively has always been a real kind of foundation of my teaching. So I've always encouraged students to do lots of writing, so writing plays, writing films, writing all sorts of creative projects. That's always been a real fundamental part of what I've done.
Thank you. 先講，如果大家有咩問題嘅話，可以預先喺個 Facebook Live 嗰度留言，跟住我哋陣間15分鐘，即係完咗15分鐘之後就會有 Q&A session 嘅。Thank you, Mark. You did mention about fun in English, which is a really important thing because many Hong Kong pupils they find English is a bit boring sometimes. But before we talk about how to learn it in an interesting or fun way, many parents mention that their child or their children are struggling to learn English in so-called a systematic approach. They just learn it pretty much all over the place, like grammar, vocabulary, but they don't have a systematic approach to learn English. So in your opinion, what is the systematic approach to learn English?
So the essential thing is to be absorbing English from as many sources as you possibly can. So for me, hearing English and hearing the language first is the most important thing. So I like my students to spend lots of time listening to things that interest them. The fundamental thing is they must be interested in the subject matter. So it matters less to me what they're listening to and more to me that they're interested. The trick that I think is important, my younger son is studying modern languages at Cambridge, and he taught me this trick. Whenever he watches a film in French or German, he has the German or French subtitles on. So not the English subtitles, but the German or French. So he's seeing as he's listening. And that is really important for making the connections between the graphemes, between the letters and between the sounds. So that's the most important way to absorb language, and to make sure that when you're listening, it's very easy to mishear when you're learning a language. And so having the subtitles and having the text on just helps you to make sure that you're hearing correctly and not mishearing. The words run into one another when you're learning a language, and I found this when I was learning French and German. It's very difficult to hear the individual words. Seeing them is key. So the first step is to hear as much language as possible. And then the second step is to speak as much. So if you can get time with a native speaker, then that is perfect. And you just need to get used to having conversations. It doesn't matter at first whether you make mistakes. It's about just getting a little bit of confidence and speaking on a simple level. So again, when my son was doing his French A-levels, he had a French assistant teacher who was from France. They spent 2 years talking about rugby, really. It didn't matter because he was talking. And so any opportunity to talk is fundamental. I think hearing and speaking have to come first. When you have a foundation in that, and ideally you should be listening to a little bit every day. So a few minutes, 10 minutes every day is time well spent if you're listening to a native speaker. And then reading needs to come after that. So after the oral language and after you're beginning to use language, then the reading follows. Again, I think that what you read is less important than the frequency. So it's important to be doing little and often. 10 minutes a day is fine. 10 minutes twice a day is better. 10 minutes twice a day is better than 20 minutes in a block. So little and often, frequency, and we know that we learn better when we're interested. So where possible, the subject matter should fit with something that you're already interested in. That's really, really important. Often language is boring because the subject matter is boring. I think when you're beginning to read, a phonics-based approach is really critical. I see with my students, when I think about, especially the younger ones, I think there are some children who are learning English who have very clearly been taught a phonics-based approach, and others who are being taught a whole word approach, so learning to recognize whole words. The ones who have the phonics background have a huge advantage. And I see that with my older students as well, because they're obviously having to learn a different set of symbols and connect those with a whole different set of sounds. There's an awful lot to learn and to relearn. And the ones who are trying to do it as a whole word approach find it very difficult, and they hit a ceiling much more quickly. The ones who have been taught a phonics-based approach, so are used to breaking a word down into its chunks and learning how to blend those sounds together, they have a massive advantage when they come across words that they don't know. And inevitably, when you're learning a language, it takes years to develop a fully grown vocabulary. So you're always coming across words that you don't know. And being able to break those words down into the sound chunks and blend those together gives you a huge advantage. English is a stupid language because we break the rules so often about the way sounds are made and the way sounds correspond to letters, and it's difficult for a native speaker, let alone somebody learning the language. But the more you can focus, especially in the early days, on recognizing those sounds, equating them to the letters, so that phonics approach, that makes a world of difference. And I find that students who take that approach are able to just make much more rapid progress. So it's listening and speaking, then it's reading, and then the writing will follow. I'm less bothered about the accuracy of the writing in the first place. I'm more interested in them reading accurately at first, and then the writing follows. Ian McEwan is one of my favorite writers, and he said it's impossible to be a good writer without being a good reader first, and I agree with that. So it follows on, and the accuracy can be fine-tuned afterwards. The grammatical accuracy that needs to come when a student has a certain fluency with the language. It's easier to fine-tune and to introduce rules then than it is to start with the grammar rules, because there are so many grammar rules in English and we break them all the time, you know. So people think about them as grammar rules, and they're not. They're just not, because like every language, we use language in so many different ways, in so many different contexts. Written English is so different from spoken English. So being obsessed about the rules of grammar in the first place will only confuse people. They need to develop a certain fluency, and then the grammar needs to be built on that step by step. So dealing with the basic things first, like tenses are obviously an issue for people coming from Chinese to English. That's one of the things that they always find most difficult, because we use tenses in a completely different way to Chinese and to a number of other languages as well. So that would be one of the first things to think about and to try to get right. And then gradually the grammatical accuracy can be built and developed from there, and the rules can be fine-tuned, but once a child is writing with a reasonable fluency so that they can communicate their meaning, then you can start to introduce the rules. And as I say, I would always start with tenses, then I would move on to verb agreements, and so making sure that the right form of the verb is used for the subject. That's another issue that people have when they come to English. And then once you've got those two things pretty well established, most of the other rules follow from there, and it's then a case of fine-tuning. But grasping those tenses and grasping those verb agreements, they're your fundamental blocks when you start writing. But as I say, I think it's really important to be listening first and speaking, then reading, and writing follows from that. And when a child is writing, then you can start, once they're communicating something and they feel that they can use the language to communicate, then I would start fine-tuning and increasing the accuracy gradually. But I would never start with grammar rules, because it doesn't make any sense. Nobody uses language in that way. When we learn our native language, we're not taught the rules. We learn it by listening, and I think the same should be true of of learning a second, third, fourth language as well. So I think that's the systematic approach that I like to take, and as I say, it's the way that I learnt foreign languages as well. So I only speak French and German, but when I was learning those, it was very much about listening first, and those other things came secondary. And that's very much my son's experience as well. And the way that he's taught currently at Cambridge is very much about listening first, and then reading and writing. Of course, he has to do a lot of it there, but so that's really my approach to it.
Good, thank you very much. Yeah, it should really go quickly, so it's time for a Q&A session already.
Fantastic, yeah.
That's fine. 有咩問題嘅話，隨時喺 Facebook Live 嗰度問。咁本身有家長已經問咗我幾個問題㗎啦，咁所以我哋一邊等緊其他家長打問題嘅時候，咁我就先問咗其他家長本身已經留俾我嘅問題。OK， Mark, while we're waiting for the parents to write down the questions in the Facebook Live, I've got some questions in place already from other parents, so we'll start from that question first. Okay.
Great.
You mentioned about fun, interesting. So is it really important to be interested in English in order to learn it well? If, just in case, the pupil is not interested in learning English at all, how can you help to let them make progress?
So I think there are two ways to approach this. Some children are just interested in language, and they're the easy ones because they're fascinated by language. I always was as a child, and those children just want to learn other languages, so that's easy. For most people who don't fall into that category, there has to be a purpose for it. There has to be a functional need for it to learn the language. It's very difficult to put in the hours if you can't see some sort of purpose down the line. It was interesting in Finland a few years ago. They noticed that suddenly boys were outperforming girls in their English by a huge amount, and that had never been the case before. Girls had always outperformed boys, and they realized it was because of the rise in online collaborative gaming. So the boys in Finland were playing games, video games, and talking to people. They all spoke in English because it was the common language. That gave them a purpose and a reason to want to learn English because they wanted to play the games more. and that translated into their school performance. So for a number of years, until girls started to catch up again, boys were outperforming girls because the boys tended to spend longer playing video games collaboratively with English speakers. So they had a reason to speak. So you have to find some way of interesting them. If they don't see a purpose in it and they're not interested in language, then the subject matter has to be interesting to them. So if they're interested in, I don't know, fishing, then reading about fishing in English is the way in. But I don't think there's a magic way of interesting somebody if they can't see a purpose for it. So if they don't fit into those two first camps, then you've got to make sure that the subject matter at first is interesting to them. It could be football. You know, they could read the football results, the football reports in a newspaper in English. That would be a way of interesting them. They would be reading English. You know, English clubs are big all around the world. That's a way that lots of people get into learning English, is reading about their football club. And so that's a good way of engaging them, when you find a subject that interests the individual, and there's no single subject that interests everybody, you know.
Thank you. We got another question from parents about the creativity in English writing. So this question is, how can we elicit the get creativity from the children in English writing?
It's about trying as many different forms as possible. So writing little plays, little film scripts, poems, little stories, and trying to find an audience for them. People write are much more enthusiastic about writing when they feel there's an audience. So there are a number of blog sites that are dedicated to children's writing. So children can be members and they can share their writing with each other. They work really nicely, and all those sites are very well organized and policed, and they need a parent to sign them up and to take an overview of them. So that can work very nicely. Sometimes writing for a grandparent and reading them your story once a week, or reading them your poem. I think if you can find an audience, then that's the key to it, because there's nothing more dispiriting than writing something creative and then nobody seeing it, or one teacher seeing it and the teacher's seeing it because they've got to mark it. It's about finding an audience, and if that is, you know, you read your story to your grandmother on a Sunday afternoon, that's fantastic. That will give a purpose to the creative writing. Writing is meaningless unless somebody is reading it or hearing it, and children know that. So when teachers try to get them to do a piece of creative writing and they know that nobody's going to read it, then it becomes a bit pointless, and they can see the pointlessness of it. When they think there's a real audience, children are creative and they will experiment with all sorts of different forms. And it's about giving them the confidence to try their work out, even if it's not finished or not perfect. Just try it to a friendly audience, a grandmother, a friend, a blog site for children's writing. There are, as I say, there are a number of good ones, but somehow find an audience for it. That's the key to helping children to be creative, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question is about the transition. You know, in England, primary school year 6, secondary school starting year 7. So there's transition problem. So the question is, what are the transition problems usually from year 6 to year 7 in terms of English language standards and the requirements at school?
There's quite a jump. That's the first thing, and that jump is a problem for native speakers as well as for non-native speakers, and of course it's more of a jump if you're less experienced with a language. So there is always a jump, and there is always a process of adjustment, and you have to, because it usually involves changing a school, so there are different methods, different ideas, different teachers. You have to accept that there's going to be a process of adjustment, and it will take a little bit of time, and it won't always be smooth, but generally most children will manage it. In terms of English, the standard increases generally in two ways. First, by the amount that they're asked to read, and secondly, by the range of vocabulary. So that's the thing that is difficult. That's why I think it's so important to be listening to English and to people who speak well in English regularly. Things like TED Talks and podcasts, good films, good TV, because the best way to develop your vocabulary is to hear a lot of it. That's a much more effective way than trying to learn lists of vocabulary, because those lists are meaningless. Language has to be used in order for us to understand it and for us to remember it. You can learn a list of words, but if you don't use them in the next week, you'll forget them. So the vocabulary is the key thing, and that's why I think listening to as much English as possible is the fundamental thing in learning English, because that's the best way to develop your vocabulary. So that's the transition, really. It's the amount of reading and the range of vocabulary, and there is an adjustment to make, and it always takes a little bit of time. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I know it's nearly 9:30 now, so I will just pretty much summarize it, and then we will just finish it today. Okay?
Yeah, fantastic.
而家大約已經9點半啦，咁如果仲有其他問題嘅話，可以問翻我咁樣，咁跟住呢一集亦都會喺 YouTube 度睇得到。如果今集有任何嘅內容對你有幫助嘅話，請你哋俾我一個 like 同埋 share 出去俾其他人睇。跟住最後講一講嘅就係 Mark 喺我哋嘅補習社本身已經教開英文，佢本身有名著精讀班啦，有閱讀理解，亦都有創意寫作班嘅。去到暑假亦都佢會推出其他嘅課程，包括一啲辯論啦，甚至升級版嘅名著精讀等等，我哋而家正在籌備當中。咁如果你之後有興趣想你讓你嘅小朋友跟 Mark 老師學英文嘅話，咁就留意我哋嘅 Facebook page 同埋再聯絡我。咁今日我哋就差唔多啦，咁所以今日就唔該晒大家 ，Thank you very much, Mark, and I'll see you next time then. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Leo. Bye bye.
Bye bye.